Grew up watching music videos, and
You really nailed it.
It was a big joke. The whole idea was that I failed at all these proposals because I was...
Over the weekend, a surge of new legal filings added further layers of complexity to the ongoing dispute, bringing renewed attention to both the legal strategies being used and the broader narrative forming around the case. Among these developments, one of the most talked about elements was a controversial argument put forward by Justin Baldoni's legal team regarding Blake Lively's public reputation, which quickly became a focal point of discussion. At the same time, a newly surfaced excerpt from Lively's deposition has fueled even more speculation, as it offers a rare glimpse into how she might respond under oath and how her testimony could shape the direction of the case if it proceeds. Despite the influx of information, many key questions remain unresolved, such as whether the matter will ultimately go to trial, be dismissed at an earlier stage, or become prolonged through ongoing procedural disputes, including issues related to timing and filings. However, two central themes clearly stand out amid all the uncertainty: the aggressive legal framing around Lively's reputation and the insight provided by her deposition, both of which could play a significant role in influencing public perception as well as the eventual legal outcomes. The argument being made leans heavily on the idea that public perception already plays a defining role in reputational claims, suggesting that many of the criticisms associated with Blake Lively were not newly created but had been circulating long before the current dispute. The comparison brought up, while controversial and clearly acknowledged in a footnote as not being literal, was still used as a legal illustration to emphasize a broader principle: that reputational damage is difficult to claim if a similar image already exists in the public domain. Even though the legal team attempted to soften the analogy by clarifying they were not equating Lively to a criminal figure, the comparison itself still stood out, almost as if it was intentionally designed to grab attention while maintaining technical legal distance. The underlying point remains that accusations, such as being difficult, tone-deaf, or unkind, had already been part of ongoing public discussions, and therefore, the defense is positioning itself to argue that these perceptions cannot suddenly be framed as newly inflicted harm worth massive financial damages. This line of reasoning ties into broader legal concepts often applied in defamation cases, where causation and measurable harm become central issues. If a reputation is argued to have already been negatively shaped by prior media coverage or public opinion, then proving that specific actions by defendants directly caused additional damage becomes significantly more challenging. In this case, the defense appears to be building toward exactly that conclusion, suggesting that a claim as large as $290 million in damages requires clear evidence that the defendants created a new wave of harm, rather than amplifying or reflecting what was already being said. From a legal standpoint, the strategy is sharp and calculated, even if the way it is presented feels provocative. It shows an awareness of how to frame arguments not just for the courtroom, but for public interpretation as well. Shifting to the deposition excerpts, the tone becomes even more revealing. In her responses, Blake Lively appears cautious, but at times uncertain, especially when pressed on specific claims, particularly regarding allegations that bots were used to damage her reputation. Initially, she expresses a belief that there was a coordinated digital effort against her, but when asked to provide concrete details such as who was told, what evidence exists, or which defendants were directly involved, her answers become less definitive. She acknowledges sharing her concerns and private messages with friends and loved ones, yet struggles to recall specifics when asked to identify recipients or provide documentation. This creates a noticeable contrast between her initial confidence in the claim and her later uncertainty when pressed for verifiable proof. As the questioning continues, the focus sharpens on whether her belief in a coordinated smear campaign is supported by evidence or primarily based on personal experience and perception. Lively points to what she describes as digital harassment and a surge of negative media coverage, as well as her long experience in the industry, suggesting she can recognize patterns in how narratives form and spread. However, when asked to directly connect these experiences to specific defendants or actions, such as orchestrating articles or using automated accounts, she stops short of making definitive claims. Instead, she frames it as a shared understanding or feeling, even referencing others in the industry who may have perceived similar patterns at the time. This back and forth highlights a key tension in the case: the difference between perceived harm and provable action. While Lively's testimony suggests she genuinely felt targeted, the legal questioning repeatedly pushes toward whether those feelings can be substantiated with clear, factual evidence. Moments where she revises or softens earlier statements, such as moving from certainty about bots being used to uncertainty, are likely to be closely scrutinized, as they can influence how credible and consistent her overall claims appear. At the same time, she does push back in certain moments, particularly when asked to speculate about the actions of others, making it clear she cannot speak directly to what the defendants did behind the scenes. Overall, the deposition excerpt paints a picture of a witness navigating a difficult line, between personal conviction and legal precision. It underscores how critical, detailed evidence and consistency will be if the case moves forward, especially given the scale of the claims being made and the broader narrative already surrounding her. Public image. In this portion of the deposition, the discussion shifts toward conversations within the cast, and whether there was any coordinated effort or influence regarding social media behavior, specifically, the decision to unfollow Justin Baldoni. Blake Lively acknowledges that there were indeed discussions, mentioning that a few cast members talked about it, and she highlights that Jenny Slate was particularly upset during the early phase of production. According to Lively, Jenny had already unfollowed Baldoni at one point, and there was some confusion later when that action appeared to be reversed, possibly by someone managing her account. Lively frames Jenny's reaction as more personal and rooted in boundaries, suggesting that there was a broader tension among the cast between wanting to support the film and also maintaining individual comfort and dignity. However, when pressed on who else she spoke to, Lively references Colleen Hoover, though the full context of that exchange is not shown here, leaving a noticeable gap that could become significant, especially since other testimony reportedly suggests a more direct influence. This incomplete picture creates an interesting contrast between how different individuals involved have described the same situation. While Jenny Slate appears cautious and measured in how she presents her involvement, avoiding placing responsibility directly on others, Colleen Hoover's account, at least as referenced here, comes across as more direct, potentially implying that Lively encouraged certain actions. That discrepancy, even without the full transcript, hints at possible inconsistencies that could be explored further if the case proceeds, particularly in evaluating credibility and intent. The questioning then pivots back to reputational harm, which remains a central issue throughout the deposition. Lively is asked directly whether she had ever been labeled a bully or mean girl in the press prior to the alleged smear campaign. Her response is careful. She avoids making absolute claims and instead emphasizes that she generally did not engage much with media coverage, while maintaining that her overall press history had been positive and stable. When pressed further, she denies recalling specific instances of being described in those terms before the events in question, but subtly shifts her argument toward the scale and intensity of the negativity rather than its absolute existence. This distinction appears to be a key part of her position, not necessarily that criticism never existed, but that the volume and coordination of it felt unprecedented. As the questioning continues, the attorney narrows the focus, attempting to get Lively to clearly identify all the specific narratives she believes were part of the alleged smear campaign. Despite repeated prompts, she consistently returns to the same core themes: attacks on her character, being labeled a mean girl, and being called a bully. When asked to provide additional examples beyond these, she struggles to do so, explaining that the top experience was overwhelming and that she intentionally distanced herself from media and online content during that time, especially given her responsibilities as a parent. This creates a tension in her testimony. She describes the situation as widespread and intense, yet is unable to recall or specify many distinct examples beyond a few central labels. The attorney's response to this is methodical and strategic. He explains the importance of specificity in a legal context, particularly in defamation-related claims where identifying the exact statements or narratives being challenged is crucial for the defense to respond effectively. General claims of widespread negativity are not enough. The defense needs concrete examples to address. This exchange highlights a critical legal dynamic, while Lively frames her experience in terms of emotional and experiential impact. The legal process demands precise, verifiable details. Ultimately, Lively attempts to reconcile this by describing those repeated accusations about her character, being a mean girl, and being a bully, as broader pillars under which many different stories and narratives fall. She suggests that while she may not be able to list every individual instance, those themes represent a larger pattern of coverage. The attorney acknowledges this framing, recognizing that there may be variations within those categories, but the underlying issue remains clear. The case may hinge on whether those broad claims can be broken down into specific, provable instances that meet the legal threshold for reputational harm. This portion of the discussion really highlights the strategic battle happening beneath the surface of the deposition. What Justin Baldoni's legal team appears to be doing is fairly methodical. They're trying to get Blake Lively to clearly lock in her claims, by narrowing her down to specific complaints like being called a mean girl, a bully, or having her character attacked. They're essentially creating a fixed record. That way, if additional accusations or examples are introduced later in court, they can challenge them by pointing out that she didn't mention those earlier when given the opportunity. It's a classic legal tactic. Limit the scope now, so nothing new can be added later without scrutiny. On the other side, Lively seems to be approaching this more cautiously, trying not to box herself into a limited set of claims. By describing the situation as broad, overwhelming, and made up of many narratives, she keeps things open. From her perspective, that may feel more accurate to her experience, but legally, it creates tension. Courts tend to rely on specifics, not general impressions. So while she frames it as a flood of negativity, the opposing counsel keeps pulling her back to what exactly was said, and by whom. That disconnect is one of the most revealing aspects of the exchange. What makes this even more significant is the introduction of older media coverage and past statements, which the defense is likely using to challenge the idea that these characterizations suddenly appeared during the alleged smear campaign. References to prior interviews, industry rumors, and reported on-set behavior are being brought in to suggest that certain perceptions, fair or not, were already circulating publicly years before this dispute. For example, past comments attributed to Lively about her early experiences on set, as well as long-standing reports about tensions with co-stars or crew, are being positioned as evidence that narratives her personality didn't emerge out of nowhere. From a legal standpoint, this ties directly back to the core argument about reputational harm. If similar criticisms existed in credible publications or industry discussions years earlier, then the defense can argue that the current situation didn't create that image, but rather echoed or amplified something already present. That doesn't automatically disprove her claims, but it does make it harder to argue that the damage is entirely new or solely caused by the defendants. The mention of articles and reports from outlets like magazines and entertainment coverage further strengthens that angle, as those sources contribute to the public record. Even anecdotes from people who worked on past productions, such as claims about on-set behavior, are being framed as part of a longer pattern. Again, whether those claims are accurate or not is a separate issue, but legally, their existence in the public sphere is what matters for this argument. Then there's the final piece. You mentioned the email from a producer raising serious concerns before filming even began. That moment stands out because of how dramatic it feels compared to everything else. The language suggesting real issues and even mentioning replacing a director immediately raises the stakes and invites speculation about what could have prompted such a strong reaction. However, without full context, it's difficult to draw firm conclusions. In legal settings, isolated excerpts like that can be powerful, but they can also be misleading if not paired with the surrounding details. Overall, what this all points to is a clash between narrative and evidence. Lively's side seems to be emphasizing the experience, the scale, intensity, and emotional impact of what she describes as a coordinated attack, while Baldoni's team is zeroing in on proof, consistency, and history. The deposition shows how those two approaches don't always align neatly, and that gap is likely where much of the legal battle will play out if the case continues. This final section really captures how dramatically the narrative can shift depending on interpretation and context. The email exchange you're describing stands out because of how serious it sounds at first. Phrases like "we have real issues" and talk of replacing a director immediately create the expectation that something major or inappropriate must have happened. Naturally, that kind of language makes it seem like a crisis-level situation, but when the details that follow are more about a rehearsal being recorded and some uncomfortable comments or misunderstandings, it creates a sharp contrast between the tone of the concern and the substance of what's being described. The rehearsal recording is clearly being framed here as a key moment of tension. From one perspective, it can be seen as a practical decision, especially during a writer's strike, where capturing improvised dialogue could help preserve performances and avoid violating rules around writing new material. Directors sometimes do record rehearsals for continuity, reference, or creative purposes. However, the issue seems to center on consent and communication. Not informing actors up front that they were being recorded, even if revealed later, can understandably make people uncomfortable, particularly in a professional setting where trust and boundaries matter. At the same time, the reaction to it, at least as presented here, does seem amplified when placed alongside the earlier, more serious-sounding concerns. That's where interpretation becomes important. One side may view this as part of a pattern of behavior that contributed to a negative environment, while the other may see it as a relatively minor or even standard industry practice that's being framed in a much more serious light after the fact. Without full context, it's difficult to definitively say which interpretation holds more weight, but it does show how the same incident can be used to support very different narratives. The mention of earlier tensions, like the comment that made Jenny uncomfortable, or the housing situation, adds to that broader picture. Individually, each incident might seem small or explainable, but collectively they can be presented as either a buildup of discomfort or, alternatively, as a series of misunderstandings being escalated. That's often how these disputes evolve. Isolated moments get grouped together to establish either a pattern of behavior or a pattern of overreaction, depending on which side is telling the story. What also stands out is the timing. As you pointed out, these concerns appear to have surfaced very early, even before some of the more serious allegations that came later. That timing is significant because it can be used in two different ways, either to argue that problems existed from the beginning, or to suggest that tensions and negative perceptions were already forming before major claims were introduced. Again, it comes down to framing. Overall, yes, it does make sense in terms of how legal and public narratives are built. even if it feels surprising or disproportionate at first glance. Situations like this often aren't about a single big moment, but rather how multiple smaller moments are interpreted, documented, and later presented. What seems minor to one side can be pivotal to the other, especially when building a case around workplace environment, intent, or reputation.